Do you ever hear people refer to something as neoclassic or neoclassical art? Do you wonder, what does that mean? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. But before we talk about what neoclassicism is, we should probably find out what classicism is. And that's why you should watch these two videos, which are the first two videos in this series, to find out what they are. So, neoclassicism. Have you ever heard of this volcano called Mount Vesuvius? If you haven't, it's this volcano in the south of Italy, and it erupted in about 79 CE. When that happened, it unfortunately buried all of its surrounding Roman cities, including these two cities called Pompeii and Herculaneum. And then, almost 1,700 years later, in 1709 and 1748, the cities of Herculaneum and Pompeii, respectively, were discovered and subsequently excavated. The discoveries of these cities, along with their art and architecture, eventually led to a concerted effort in Europe to find, excavate, retrieve, and conserve these artifacts on a continual basis. It also became popular from the 18th century for scholars, students, and travelers to tour these ancient cities and study their artifacts. This is often known as the Grand Tour. Thus, another wave of renewed interest and curiosity in the Greco-Roman world, as well as their artistic traditions, spread throughout Europe, and eventually even to the New World. Therefore, the principles of harmony, simplicity, and proportionality became prominent again in a lot of European art. Neoclassicism is also often associated with the Age of Enlightenment, which was, and some would argue still is, a movement away from religious doctrine and towards scientific reasoning and rational thinking. Like its previous incarnations, Neoclassicism also carried into architecture. Now, it's not a coincidence that a lot of architecture in France, as well as the United States, from the 18th century on, followed the rules of Roman architectural principles. Because what else happened in France and the United States in the 18th century? They decided to abandon their monarchs as their head of state and formed these republics, much of it modeled after the Roman Republic. Now, of course, not all of it really worked out in the beginning and it was really violent, but we're not really talking about the success of these republics. We're kind of just trying to understand the ideals they were trying to follow. Now, essentially what they were trying to do was model themselves after the Greco-Roman ideals, including government style as well as architectural and aesthetic principles. But of course, the neoclassical movement was definitely not just limited to France and the US. Many different individuals from many different countries in Europe took the Grand Tour. And a lot of them came home with a series of books called the 4 Books on Architecture by Italian architect Andrea Palladio, as we mentioned in the last episode. And with these books, many architects and designers later carried out a lot of its architectural principles in their own designs. Thus, neoclassical buildings dating back to the 18th and 19th century, some of it still surviving today, can be found also in countries like England and Germany. And here's the thing, classicism really doesn't stop there either. There continues to be interest in classicism, and artists are always developing new ways to interpret and carry out its traditions in their own unique ways throughout the 20th century as well as today. A lot of Palladio's and Vitruvius's discussions and explorations on harmony, simplicity, and proportionality are definitely still very relevant topics in architectural theories today. The humanist movement and ideas of human virtue beyond religious doctrine is a philosophical topic that also continues to be explored. The more you study art history, the more you realize there's really no definitive beginnings and ends to pretty much any artistic styles and movements. To some people, classicism might seem like the style that's just kind of formal and rigid, and maybe to some people it's not very interesting. But to me, it is an endless, fascinating story of how humans like you and I are continually trying to orient ourselves and find structure amongst all this chaos in the world. And they're largely based on the writings of famous Roman architect/engineer Vesuvius. Not Vesuvius, Vitruvius. Much of Vitruvius and Palladio's discussions and explorations on simplicity, harmony, and proportionality are still very relevant topics in architectural theory today.